Hey, before we get into the episode, I wanted to let you know we have spots available right now to help you produce your own sales asset, to take your show from content machine to conversion machine. We do not often have production spots open. However, we do have 2 right now. So if this is something that's on your list for 2025, now is really the time for us to have that conversation. Head on over to uncommonlymore.com/production and you can learn absolutely everything and book a call so you and I can sit down for 30 minutes, see if now is the right time, and if not, figure out what you need to do to get ready to work with a production team like ours. Again, uncommonlymore.com/production to book that chat. No matter whether you work with us or not, you will walk away from that call with some actionable next steps for your show. I cannot wait to chat with you. I'll see you there. Now get into the episode. We're going to learn to audit a podcast today. Well, we're going to learn to audit a portion of our podcast, specifically your calls to action, because when we're using our podcast to generate, educate, and convert right fit clients, we've got to make sure we're actually moving the listeners into action. So what can we be doing to make sure we're actually doing that? It's audit our show, audit our sales asset to make sure we've built it to do that job. All right, let's dig in. Welcome to the More Profitable Podcast with Stacey Harris. I'm Stacey, and this is the spot to learn more about the strategies, tactics, and tools you need to build your more profitable podcast. My team and I work every day with podcasters like you to shift shows from frustrating time sucks to productive members of your sales team, because your show should be built to generate and convert leads. So let's get into it. One of the first questions I ask when on the intake form for the podcast strategy intensive is for you to send me a sales asset. That sales asset, that episode, that's what I want you to review after we're done listening to this. So after you and I talk now, I want you to listen to that sales asset and reflect on the things we're talking about in this conversation, because you and I are going to go through 3 of the things I listen for when I'm doing those audits. So this is going to give you some perspective. I call it adding fact to feeling, because when we're in that cadence, we're going to call it, that routine of record episode, produce episode, release episode, record episode, produce episode, release episode. When we're in that cycle, it gets really hard to get perspective. That's one of the reasons we do things like podcast strategy intensives. It's one of the reasons we meet quarterly with our production clients, is because it forces you. It's me sort of like mama lion style, grabbing you by the neck and pulling you out of the chaos that is moment to moment and getting a high level view at your podcast so that we can be building in an alignment of your goal, which if you listen to this, if you and I talk regularly, it's to build a sales asset, a functioning member of your sales team, essentially, right? This is the closest we're going to get to like cloning ourselves and letting that clone handle sales. That's your podcast. It's how we clone a sales only version of you, and not sales only. There's conversation, there's connection, there's education. But we're building something that's going to move them forward even when we're not there. You know that old online business BS, frankly, around like making money while you sleep. Your podcast is part of that. Because this is where we're having the conversation when you and I are not having an actual conversation. And so for that to be a thing, for that to function, I've got to grab you by the hand and pull you out of this from time to time. I've got to be able to grab you and say, hey, let's go look at this from up here, because we are not going to solve big problems with small views. We need big views. Now, I'm not saying we're solving big problems. I'm not saying that your podcast has a big problem, but if it's missing one of the things we're going to talk about today, that is a problem. It's a thing that needs to be addressed sooner rather than later, because I want you to be building rock solid sales assets inside of every episode. Just because the episode's value-based, just because the episode's an interview, does not mean you're not building a sales asset. Different sales assets have different jobs, right? There's a whole journey that our clients go through. We know this. I don't need to give you the really gross cliche about getting married on the first date, right? I don't need to do that. You're good. So we need to have each of these sales assets doing their job to help move people through that journey so that when we do talk to them, we are looking to get married. We are looking to move this relationship to a more invested place, right? A more serious place, because that's where actual progress happens. That's where actual change is made. So that's what we're going to talk through today. Before we do that, I want to remind you, as I have been sharing, we have the new format up over at the Podcast Newsroom. If you go to thepodcastnewsroom.com, you can get signed up. We have been answering questions over there. Over the last couple of weeks, we've talked about building content for your right fit client. We've talked about leveraging your podcast as a tool to grow your email list. We've talked about if you have built a show and now you're trying to reverse engineer a business, or you've built a show and now you're trying to turn it into the sales tool that you hoped it would be when you started, but you didn't totally set it up to be. It's been some good stuff. So head on over again, thepodcastnewsroom.com, to get your questions answered. New episodes come out twice per month there, the first and the third Monday of each month. You get a new episode answering a new question. So be sure to head on over and get your access set up today. Let's dig into the first piece I want to be looking at. So after you've identified your sales asset, the first thing I want to be really objectively looking at is context, your timing of your CTAs. Where are you putting those calls to action? Because oftentimes it's a lot about placement and not just timing, like, oh, it should be at the 4-minute mark or the end of your show or the beginning of your show or dead center in the middle. No, context matters. What is happening around it? So as we always do, let's use this episode as an example. We have had a call to action already. We just talked about the Podcast Newsroom. That was a call to action. It made sense in the context of what was happening. If somebody had just happened on the show and they were listening for the first time, they would be able to identify that there is an opportunity for even more great content like this one. I gave an example of some things that happened there. There's an off-ramp onto what's next right there at the beginning to catch people who maybe have been listening for a while, maybe are brand new but are super excited, whatever it is. But it's free. I'm not 4 or 5 minutes into the episode saying, hey, come join us for production. The only time you're going to hear from me a paid offer early in an episode is under 2 circumstances. One, it's a dynamic ad. We're running a dynamic ad a couple of times a year for something that's paid, either because we've got podcast strategy intensives open or we've got the, a spots open in production. I'll often put a dynamic ad for that because I know that there are people who listen to this show for a long time before they decide now is the right time for them. So when we do have an opening for a production client, which we don't always have, I try to make sure that I put a little note at the top of our episodes. The other thing you're going to regularly hear about is the Podcaster Mastermind, the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. When that's open, I need to let you know because that is the only sort of time-locked element in all of my offers is that. And so I need to let you know. So that's one. Dynamic ad will occasionally go in front of all episodes, and occasionally it is to promote something paid. It is also sometimes to promote something not paid. It is not always a paid ad, but that is one of the contexts where you might, before we really get into it, get a call to action that is an investment. The other time where you will hear a call to action that is not a free call to action earlier in a show is when I'm doing an audio sales page. Because often in the intro, I will tell you, today we're going to talk through an offer. If you want to know more about, often the whole episode is a call to action. Here's the reality, though, is that's rarely, and I can't think of where it would be, the first point of contact for someone. Generally, the listenership of those episodes is somebody who's choosing to listen to that episode to learn about that program, service, product, whatever it may be. And so there's not a hard and fast never ever rule, as I've just shown you 2 exceptions that I make. With that said, in a standard setting aside dynamic ads, setting aside an audio sales page, a standard episode like this one, you're not going to hear me talking about a paid offer with a serious call to action early in the episode. What you will hear, and this is why I talk about context and not timing, is one of the very first things I said to you coming out of the intro was a mention of the podcast strategy intensive, which, spoiler alert, will be your call to action in this episode. Because this is built out from an element of the work inside of that offer. And so at no point have I said, and go book yours now, or like tried to sell you that. I've given you context of where this information is coming from. And I have planted some seeds so that when I do later in the episode say, let's book your podcast strategy intensive, it's not the first you've ever heard of it. You're like, oh yeah, I know what happens in there because we've been talking about it. And this is, again, why we're talking about context and not timing. There is not a sort of like insert here, Mad Lib style format that's going to make space for your calls to action. And it's math, right? You put it here. No, this is art meets science. The art is the context, is the knowing what's going to be around it. And that's how I want you to decide your timing. That's what I want you to decide as far as what goes here and what goes there, and making sure there are opportunities for all. I will say I do like 2 calls to action. There are a lot of schools of thought where 2 is too many. There's also schools of thought where it's tell them about everything because you never know what ramp they're going to want to get off on. I am of the school of thought of 1 and 1, 1 free, 1 paid. And so you may hear me mention other things. You may hear again, context, right? You may hear me talk about something else we've got going on. I can't think of anything right now because we don't have anything else going on. But like when we do roundtables, sometimes you'll hear me talk about the podcast newsroom and the roundtable in the course of a conversation. But full on calls to action, that moment where I say, go do this now, here's your next step, there's going to be 1 free and 1 paid. The free one is going to go earlier in the episode, and the paid one is going to go closer to the end. Because everything we've talked about in the episode has brought us to the offer at the end. Much like you would structure any kind of free content, webinar, social. What we've discussed brings us to the journey of our call to action. And I think this is the last element of context that I want us to talk about, but I think that's the missing piece for a lot of us, is that when we're building content that comes to a natural conclusion of, and here's how we do this together, when we build content that is connected with our offer and where we are in our sales cycle, it becomes insanely easy to make that call to action. It also makes it insanely easy for the listener to understand that that's their next step, to understand that that's what they're working towards, and make a decision. Is now the right time? Is it not? Is this the right fit for me? Is it not? These are the decisions we've got to be making available to the listener in each and every episode. And understanding that brings us to our next point. Are we making an ask that makes sense? This becomes a no-brainer when we separate strategy and production, when we separate strategy and recording, when we take the time to understand the job of our podcast in the season we're in our business. So I know when I'm going into Q1, I'm going to have a time of year where we do tend to bring in more production clients. That start of the year, fresh year, fresh team members or fresh podcast goals, whatever it may be. But that front of the year is frequently a hot time for us to bring in production clients. I know if I'm going into Q3, I'm probably going to have the Profitable Podcaster Mastermind. And so the kind of content I need to be putting out, the people who I need to be speaking to, the calls to action that I need to make are different in those 2 periods of time, Q1 and Q3, right? When I know that and I build a plan to speak to that and to support that, I'm able to craft content that naturally takes us to that decision point, that naturally supports that call to action that I need to make. I get to intentionally build the context that we were talking about before because I've taken a step back and I have aligned my podcast and my content with my sales goals, with my sales systems, with my sales focus, with my overall business growth goals. Now we're having a big picture conversation and not just trying to execute a task that someone told us was important. Because when we don't build a strategy first, when we don't have an understanding of why each episode is going out, both for the listener and for ourselves, we're just keeping up with the machine. We're just checking a marketing box so that we feel like we did something. It's procrastination, and it's expensive, and it's exhausting, and it's never going to get us where we want to be. And so the first step to making sure that the ask you're making makes sense is to make sure that you have a clear understanding of what ask you need to be making right now. And then building content that naturally moves them to that ask. Again, spoiler alert, we're going to talk about a podcast strategy intensive. This is the work of a podcast strategy intensive. And so when I sat down and I knew I wanted to be talking about podcast strategy intensives this quarter, as we move through this section of this quarter, I knew the content needed to tie to that ask. And so we're breaking down what are the things someone needs to know before they do a podcast strategy intensive. In the course of going through this episode, it's going to help a listener, and I hope it's helping you, identify if they're ready or not. That's what this episode is. It's a readiness assessment. Because yes, there is a ton of value here because you're able to now go through, listen to your sales asset and say, I'm doing or not doing these things, or here's where I'm doing them, but I could make them better. You know, I'm big on those 1% adjustments. I think that the 1% adjustment always pays more dividends than the 50% adjustment does because we don't know what works when we change too much at once. We don't know why something is working or not working when we make too many changes all at once. And so I'm able to give you this value so that you can see where can I make those 1% adjustments. But I'm also able to let you see, oh, I actually don't have a ton of clarity around what I'm selling quarter to quarter. Maybe that's the actual issue. Before I solve this problem, I need to solve that problem. Or I struggle alone to see the big picture. Yeah, it's time to have a conversation with Stacey, sit down, book a podcast strategy intensive, and work through this with somebody. It's a readiness assessment. And I can present that readiness assessment to you because I knew what I was selling. Because I knew what people need to know to get into that program or to get into that offer and see results. Because I knew how to give value that helps the listener, you, better understand if now is the right time. And I can follow that up with our third piece, which is make it easy. Stop making it hard for them to pay you. I actively so often get so mad about this. This is where the soapbox is coming out, love, because I will die on this hill. This drives me crazy. We make it too hard for people to pay us. And I'll be honest with you, this is something I'm untangling for parts of my offers right now too. Because full disclosure, like super transparent here, this is something I'm shifting this quarter. I'm actively working on this for a podcast strategy intensive because I think I'm making it too hard for you to pay me right now. So we're shifting some things. You'll notice if you've looked at the sales page before and you're looking at it again now, you'll notice there's now two options. There's an option to book and just get it on your calendar, or have a call with me and see what's what. Before, you had to go through a sales call with me to book an intensive. I had a whole extra step in there that didn't need to be. Now, the reason there is still an option to book a call with me is because for some people that does feel supportive. For some people, they do, I call them a fact finders, right? They want to ask all the questions. It's a trust but verify kind of thing. And maybe this is true for you. You're somebody who's like, yeah, no, I want to have a conversation to make sure that podcast Stacy and call Stacy are the same Stacy. By the way, they are. I am not nearly talented enough for it to not be. But I need to check that out. And for others, for people who are like me, who are real high on that quick start, I'm a 10, baby. I don't want to have a whole unnecessary call. When we get on the call, I want it to be the call I'm booking. I want us to be just getting into action. We've built trust. I've made my decision. A sales call is only you potentially talking me out of it. Just let me pay you. Just let me do this now. Because also, if I don't book this now, we have completely, I have run into a brick wall and lost all excitement and energy. And so why am I creating that? So I made a shift to make it easier. The same is true with our calls to action in the podcast. If we're trying to send them to website.com/offer-offer-offer/offer, no one's doing that. This is one of the reasons I own the domain names, the Podcast Newsroom and podcastnewsroom.com. Those domains both redirect to uncommonlymore.com/podcast-news, which is where the actual landing page for the Podcast Newsroom exists. Can you imagine if I sent you to uncommonlymore.com/podcast-news? You'd slap me in the face. Let's be honest. Like, that's ridiculous. It's true. No one is doing that. But when I do send you in the direction of podcastnewsroom.com, you can remember that. You can absolutely type that in, get where you need to go, and rock and roll. Make it easy. Make it their logical next step. This really, when I'm talking about making it easy, I'm talking about tying everything we've talked about together. Understand the context. Make sure that ask makes sense. And then make it, doing those two things is what will make it easy for them to take action. So don't throw up a brick wall there. Make that next step easy. Include those links in your show notes. That little description box that's going to show up on their podcast player, make sure that's got the link there. Recognize that not every place has clickable links. And so just hyperlinking it, not always going to be your best option. Sometimes you may need to type it out. That way I can go in and at least copy and paste it. Make it easy. And above all else, stop making it harder. We all do it. I guarantee you, you're doing it somewhere. I'm still doing it somewhere. We're all guilty of this. So I want you, as we wrap this up, to do me a solid. Take some time this week. Put it on your calendar, put it in your project management software as a task, whatever's going to get you to actually do it. Listen to the episode that you consider your best sales asset from the last 3 to 6 months. If you don't have an episode you consider a sales asset in the last 3 to 6 months, we need to have a whole other conversation. Assuming you do, because you're here and we're friends and you would never. Listen to that episode and think through what we talked about today. Listen for those calls to action. Did they make sense in the context, or did they pull us in and pull us out? Did they make sense with the content around it? Did you build content that led them to that call to action? Were you doing things like planting seeds? Were you doing things like helping them make connections? Does your call to action feel like a logical next step as you've gone through the content? And then make it easy. Is there a way to currently make that call to action easier to get to? Is it about buying and redirecting a shorter or easier to remember URL? Is it about setting up a pretty link that just redirects right on your same website? Because we've got a version of that too. There's uncommonlymore.com/newsroom is the other place that will redirect you to uncommonlymore.com/podcast-news. Make it easy. Where is a place where you can make it 1% easier for them to get there? A great first step, if this is feeling overwhelming, surprise, surprise, here we are. Let's book your podcast strategy intensive. Like I said, you can now book it and just get on my calendar and not have to worry about a sales call. We can also sit down and have a conversation and make sure that this is the right fit and the right time for you. Either way works for me. Go to uncommonlymore.com/intensive to find both options. And I'll see you right back here next week. Bye. Thanks so much for listening to the show. Remember that content consumption does not make changes. So commit to doing something from today's episode. Maybe it's taking action on what we talked about. Maybe it's reaching out to me and learning more about podcast strategy intensives or what podcast production looks like with our team. All of that is over at uncommonlymore.com. And if you haven't yet signed up for the podcast newsroom, I want to remind you that is a great next step. If you're not really sure what comes next, hang out over there. Get those exclusive private episodes. That's over at podcastnewsroom.com. And the last favor I will ask, because social proof is endlessly important for sure, is to leave a rating or review for the show. If you go to ratethispodcast.com/more, that's the easiest way to do it. But I would love to hear what you thought of the show, what you think of the show, and if the show has been helpful for you. I can't wait to chat with you. So this is just the start of the conversation. Reach out so we can keep it going. Talk soon.